Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today we're going to review a really grail camera, the Sony Alpha 1, or Sony A1 as it's called, for astrophotography. Okay, it's filming me right now, and I'm too lazy to tear it all down and put something else up, and we're just going to do this, okay? So the Sony Alpha 1 is obviously a really nice camera, overall well regarded. Does a lot of cool things. Very fast camera, 50 megapixel, full frame sensor, capable of 30 frame per second RAW. Not at all relevant for astrophotography. 8K could be if you're doing 8K video of astronomical events, say something like Aurora. But overall, this is a good way to squeeze out more value from what's a very expensive piece of technology. So, is it good for astrophotography? Well, yeah, duh. But we'll go look at it now. I don't mean that we're going to look at the samples. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom, wherein we're going to look at some samples and chat about the Sony Alpha 1, now I would assume 3.5-year-old-ish camera. So possibly something that might actually be getting discontinued or replaced sometime soon, maybe within the next year, who knows. But that being said, let's get some stuff out of the way. I have some samples here, and since these ones are a little bit more, I should say, deliberate than the usual samples, I might not be posting these, I'm not sure. Maybe some to give you a little bit of a taster, but since pretty much every sample from all of my at least wide lens reviews where there's like a tripod shot, since all those are done with the Alpha 1, if you want, follow the link from one of my other reviews and download some of those. And that will give you a good look at things like, let's say, the noise in the frame, etc. So speaking of that link in the description, it'll bring you back to ferventastronomy.com, and it will give you a choice. You can read an article written by some very smart, fine people about ISO invariance, because you'll notice that this camera, almost every image here is shot at ISO 500. That is because this camera only has two, and I'm making air quotes here, real ISO values, one at 100 and one at 500. It's a dual gain sensor in this camera. And what that does is it lets us retain some highlight information. Instead of shooting, at a higher ISO than this, we shoot at 500. We maintain maybe some highlights like bright stars, but conversely, we still get the same noise profile. We still get the same shadows, still get everything the same as we would if we shot at like ISO 5000 or something like that, as long as the exposure and aperture is the same. If you want that explained to you more clearly, if you're not familiar with the concept, like I said, there's that link there that you can follow and read up. Also, any tracked shots such as these are tracked with Fornax Mounts LighTrack II, which you can learn more about on Fervent Astronomy's website, because Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's North American distributor. And finally, if there's any samples, follow that link back and they'll be there as well. And as always, any samples that I provide are merely for personal use of assessment of the gear. Please don't redistribute them anywhere, online or otherwise. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't use them as the basis for your own review, etc., etc. Just please use them to assess the equipment only. Thank you kindly. All right, so we have a bunch of samples here. These are all variously taken, and I'm just gonna run through a couple of them while I chit-chat about the camera. One thing that I would mention about this camera in particular is that by having that ISO 500 in there as the second stage of the amplifier, the analog amplifier, you really do get some nice clean images, and they are at a higher brightness than they usually would be with another camera such as, like the A7R Mark IV or Mark V. So this is out of camera. This is obviously Aurora. This was a shot I did one night when there was supposed to be a big storm, and it didn't happen until the morning when the sun started to rise. So that was funny, but I did get some shots here. And as you can see, while it's a bit crunchy in the shadows where things were almost black, it's actually half decent. We get some detail of what's actually in those shadows. And at normal viewing distances, it looks like it's supposed to. Of course, this is out of focus, but the parts that had a little bit more lighting, and again, we're at 400% here with a 50 megapixel sensor. These parts look a-okay. If we look at something a little bit more Milky Way-ish, this is a 10-second untracked exposure. And one thing you would want to do in a situation like this, especially when you're out in the dark, is make sure that that back LCD when you're taking a shot isn't lighting everything up and isn't wasting your battery. So one thing I do appreciate about the Alpha 1, as opposed to some of the older Sony cameras, like the A7R Mark II, for example, is that you can turn the LCD screen off and the EVF doesn't turn on in concert. Like you can scroll through and just have everything shut off so you can save some battery life, do a time lapse, or gather some photos of, whatever, basically. So this is a 10-second exposure, f1.8, ISO 500. Reset it. This is out of the camera, so you can see that when we boost it, this noise here is indicative of what you can expect. A little bit of star trailing, probably could tolerate even a little more, to be honest. Get some better exposure, because here in the foreground, things are still very chunky. The little bit of snow and ice and glacier stuff we have here shows up okay-ish, but the darker rocks in the mountains, and indeed the foreground here looks like a little bit yucky. We'll just raise the shadows a couple times and see if we can. Yeah, look at that. Lots of color noise. Pretty gross. Oof. Ooh. Yeah, you don't want to go raising the shadows here, right? So that's a 10-second exposure. Obviously, you'd want to do a foreground stack if you're going to do something like that. But as I said, with that LCD screen, it is nice that you were able to turn it off. The brightness is adjustable. There's a brightness thing in the menu, but you get like really bright, or you get medium bright, or maybe like slightly low brightness. It's still pretty bright. There's no red option, although I suppose you could get some red photography gel or Rubylith or something like that and cut a couple squares out and put it over the LCD and do it that way. It's too bad that's not in there, and it is too bad it's not a full flip screen, because sometimes you're in an angle where the just small articulation that they do give you doesn't really do the job. But overall, it's very serviceable. The only thing I would advise against is relying too much on the back LCD or the EVF, really. By the way, here is, what do we got? Eagle and Omega Nebulae. This shot, reset, this is straight out of camera. This is a roughly 3-minute exposure with the Red Cat 51, William Optics Red Cat 51. Tracked shot, of course, with the LighTrack II, ISO 500, f4.9. And this is just a brightening to help us assess things. But yeah, basically don't rely too much on the LCD or the EVF, I'm sorry to say, or the EVF when it comes to zooming in and trying to assess star shapes, because it can lead you astray. They actually don't show you things as clearly as you might need to see if you want to notice something like this, for instance, which you'll see the stars are shaped a little bit oblong here, a little bit smushed, and they're a little bit bloated versus the center of the frame where they're a little tighter. Look at the bottom here. They're definitely defocusing. There's some field curvature here because I don't have the tilt probably set correct. Yeah, not able to see that in the EVF or the back of the LCD. And thus you end up coming into Lightroom here, maybe years later, realizing that some of this isn't really actually that useful of an image, which sort of sucks. But if we look here in the Eagle Nebula, we can see the detail is actually really good. So we've got some of the pillars here. 50 megapixels does a great job. And, we are getting a fair amount of that hydrogen alpha emission through the sensor filters. Pop down here to the Omega Nebula, same sort of thing. And yeah, so nice to have. I will say 50 megapixels is nice to have. But yeah, don't rely on that EVF and stuff. One thing that I did find, and here's a shot, I think from the same day as this one, just a little earlier, it looks like. And we'll just really quickly reset. So this is straight out of camera, right? Notice we're getting quite bright with this star down here, and I think this is Deneb. So we're getting quite bright. We might lose the highlights. I wonder, can we bring back some color in there? Yeah, you can actually get fairly well in there. So this is one of the reasons why I like to shoot at the second base ISO for these cameras, because it gives us the ability to recover this. And instead of just having a big clipped blob, we could conceivably get a little bit more detail in there. But this is obviously the North American Nebula. And we'll just go back to that out of camera. I think I just boosted the exposure a couple notches here. And yeah, we actually get a fairly decent reproduction of hydrogen alpha. Here you can see it's not too bad of a job. It does look a little bit more magenta, and there's a slight purplish bluish cast here. Whereas if you were to pump this through just straight hydrogen alpha, it would be red. It's really, really red. But this I like. It's not bad. It is definitely workable. You don't need to necessarily go full H alpha on this, but you could blend it with something else if you want. And overall, having that 50 megapixel sensor as we see here is pretty useful. And I lost my train of thought a little bit, so I'll just pick up on whatever random thing I have to say. So actually, for stuff like this, it does have an internal intervalometer, but I always get really confused by the intervalometers that companies build into their cameras. So I haven't really been able to, and mind you, I haven't put a ton of effort into it, figure out if you can do greater than 30-second shots. So when I'm using it for wide field, for time lapse or something, that's great, like 2-second shots of aurora, easy peasy lemon squeezy. But here, when we're doing 300 seconds, like 5-minute tracked exposure, I would like it to keep doing that over and over again, but I have to use an external intervalometer. And here, now that I'm seeing how long this is, the stars are decently round, maybe a little itty bitty bit of deck drift coming in here, but overall pretty good for 5 minutes. LighTrack II, just saying, no guiding, no nonsense, but yeah, the fact that you have to use an external intervalometer is kind of a pain for longer shots like this. So if there is a way to use it for longer exposures as compared to just 30 seconds, let me know. One thing that the camera lacks that I'm really kind of bummed that they didn't add in, which they easily could have, was the A7R Mark V's ability to choose a custom bulb time. They just straight up don't give you that. They easily could have added it back when they put that firmware out here, I think earlier this year, was it? But they didn't. So while it's still a great camera, still obviously can take a very, in this case, slightly underexposed image, bring out a lot of detail, although I will say there is some noise here that could have been cleaned up a little bit had I remembered to actually shoot this at the right ISO. I got my cameras confused and put the Alpha 1 at 320 and the A7R Mark IV at 500. Whoops. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So the image quality is really great. It's just a couple of nitpicks with the usability in some cases, only because that functionality has now been added into later cameras, and they still sell this camera brand new as their flagship. You would think they'd want to keep their flagship up to date, but I guess I'm not a marketing genius. So here we have another aurora from that same spot just the day after. This is straight out of camera, and this is after we bring back some of that exposure. And as you can see in the, at least in the more well-exposed portions of the frame here, very little noise. It's a different story if we come down here into the foreground, mind you, but yeah, very flexible, right? Not too bad at all. And yeah, here's a really short shot, I think 8 seconds, taken at f1.4 with the 24mm G Master. I've had to come in here. This is sort of a halfway edit. This is after the color noise reduction got cranked, but you can see there's still a ton of luminous noise, which is unfortunate. I probably could have shot this longer. It is at ISO 500. I don't know why I didn't. I think probably I was trying to keep the stars around, but that was a bit misguided on my part, to be honest. If we reset it here, this is straight out of camera. Yeah, sometimes you don't always make the best decisions, but you know what? This particular image is still recoverable. I will say that the reason this is a partial edit is because I threw the AI noise reduction on it, and that worked a treat. And then I continued the edit from there. So yeah, that is one. We're kind of in a nice spot in the future where we have access to that kind of stuff, because it really can make a big difference. And I don't hold my nose over that type of thing so much. I'm willing to let it assist my art, just not letting it completely generate new art for me. I think that's my personal line. But yeah, here, what do we got? 30-second exposure. This is tracked. This is from when that comet came through in the spring and past the Andromeda Galaxy. I still need to do something with this. Foreground shot here. This is a 2-minute shot. Well, it's a little muddy here, but as far as overall exposure, I think it's pretty good. Noise levels look all right. So let's do one diagnostic thing here. Let's compare really quickly the Alpha 1 with some of its, I don't know, contemporaries maybe, or at least some comparison shots here. So here we have the Alpha 1 on the left with the Nikon ZF on the right, 50 megapixels versus 24. And this 24 megapixel sensor has been around for a long time in different iterations of cameras. So there's a chance that you might have a camera that kind of has the same chip in it. But let's see what we get with 50 versus 24 megapixels. Right off the jump, more detail, right? I think we can agree, despite the fact the way this is working is the magnification can blow up the photo on the left more because there's just more pixels to zoom into as opposed to the one on the right. But if you look at the Orion Nebula here, a lot more clear. This is shot with the same lens, by the way, perfectly focused, same night. So just more detail. I don't think anyone's going to be too surprised with that. The noise levels actually look fairly similar, so not too much difference there. I think you could probably make an argument one way or the other that maybe the A1 has a little bit more noise than the ZF here, but I don't think it's a big issue. Then let's compare it with another 50 megapixel sensor. This one's the Canon 5DSR. And my 5DSR, I astro modified. So this is going to affect the colors a little bit. I have, for all these photos, adjusted them to try and match the brightness and the histogram if you watch right there. Obviously, it's a little more difficult to do with the colors, but let's zoom in. And again, despite the heavy bias to the reds for the 5DSR here, this is still, I think, Canon's highest megapixel consumer digital camera, 50 megapixels versus 50 megapixels. So we see that there is a fairly equivalent amount of detail. Like if we look at the shadows here, you know, we are getting some very similar levels of detail as you would expect. As far as noise levels go, it looks like the 5DSR has a little bit more noise, and there, I think, is actually a real good reason for that. It's because I could be wrong. I don't have a source for this, but I believe Canon's DSLRs, they didn't apply spatial filtering, whereas with a lot of Sony's cameras, including basically all the recent ones, they did. Spatial filtering is noise reduction that gets baked into the RAW, and it is where the concept of star eater comes from. If you've heard of that term before, it's popped up in Sony cameras, Nikon cameras over the years in different ways. And with this camera, you can see, this is a really good comparison actually, the star shapes are a little bit wonky. They're not, sometimes they're round, sometimes they're oblong, sometimes they're long in a different way. That gets the concept of a bright spot, but it messes the shape and color up. Where if you compare it to the 5DSR on the right, they do stay round. Pretty much everywhere there's a star, it is round. So a little more noise here. The spatial filtering that causes this is there for the purpose of reducing noise. So it makes sense that we'd have less noise in this file, but for my money, I'd rather have this, basically. I'd rather have the rounder stars, maybe more correct colors, and then be able to deal with the noise myself. That said, the detail level is very similar. And finally, let's compare it to one of its siblings, the A7R Mark V. So Alpha 1 on the left, A7R Mark V on the right. 20% more megapixels. Let's see what goes down over here. All right, so on the right, more resolution. It's going to be a smidge, it should be a smidge clearer, and it does look it. But also does look like it has a little bit more noise. So I feel like for this camera, Sony toned back that spatial filtering a bit, because you can see here the stars are looking a little better in the A7R Mark V as compared with the Alpha 1. They look a little rounder, they're getting warped less, so I think here, while there's more noise, it's because it's not getting baked in noise reduction as hard. I'm sure it's still there, but it's looking okay to me. And compared to the A7R Mark IV, I think the Mark V has actually got a better rendition. See a different video at some point in the future for that, but yeah, still very cromulent, right? Getting a lot of detail. At this viewing distance, let's say you're capturing Barnard's loop and all that kind of good stuff, you're never going to notice that, but yeah, that is something to keep in mind. So this has gone long enough, about twice as long as I really wanted it to. So I hope you found some of this interesting, and let's wrap this up. So how was that? That's pretty good, right? Yeah, it's good. Obviously it's good. The 50 megapixel sensor is actually pretty decent for astrophotography because it's got 2 analog amplification steps, and the second one's at ISO 500, which means that you've actually got a fairly high ISO where you start your second step of the ISO range there. And that means you can squeeze out some more exposure, dynamic range, what have you, with the ability to kind of keep your exposures a smidge shorter, maybe 15-second exposures with a f1.4 lens or an f1.8 lens. Definitely for Milky Way and that type of stuff. Excellent. That being said, don't run out and buy that camera for astrophotography specifically. There's lots of things you could do. If you have that camera, do astrophotography with it. You'd be crazy not to. If you are wondering, if you're like on the fence, you know, I do wildlife and I do landscape and sports or whatever, but I need one more thing. Is it good for astrophotography? Okay, let's push you over the edge, go buy it. I just test the equipment. It's up to you to figure out if it's for you. So I hope you have enjoyed our review of the Sony Alpha 1 A1, and I hope that's been useful for you for astrophotography. I'm Darren. This has been Fervent Astronomy. Thanks so much. Hopefully we'll see you in the next review.